The carriage door swung open before Eleanor Whitmore could steady her breath, and a gust of cold night air rushed in, as if the house itself wanted to swallow her whole. She had known this moment was coming for 11 days, ever since her father sat across from her at the dinner table and told her, without looking up from his plate, that she would marry the Duke of Marchmont before the month was out. She had not screamed. She had not wept in front of him. She had simply set down her fork and asked how much he owed. The answer had been enough to explain everything. Now she stood at the foot of a house that rose out of the darkness like a warning, its windows glowing faintly gold against black stone, its iron gates already swinging shut behind her carriage, as though someone inside had been waiting, watching, counting the minutes until she arrived. She had heard the stories about this man the way every young woman in London had heard them, whispered behind fans and repeated at breakfast tables like a kind of dark entertainment. They said he had ended a man's career with a single sentence spoken in Parliament. They said his own cousin had vanished from society after crossing him, never to be seen at another gathering again. They said his first wife had died under circumstances no one quite wanted to explain, and that he had not shed a single tear at her funeral. Eleanor did not know which of these stories were true. She only knew that in 11 days, she had gone from being an ordinary gentleman's daughter to being handed over like a debt paid in full. A servant in dark livery opened the front door before she reached it. He did not smile. He did not offer a single word of welcome. He simply stepped aside and let her enter a hall so vast and so silent that her own footsteps sounded like an intrusion. "His Grace will see you in the drawing room," the servant said at last, his voice flat, as though he had said the same words to other frightened women before her, and expected to say them again. Eleanor's hands were shaking, though she tried to hide it by clasping them together in front of her skirts. She had imagined this meeting 100 times since her father's announcement, had built the Duke in her mind out of every rumor she had ever heard, until he had become something closer to a monster than a man. She half expected to find him waiting with a cruel smile, the kind of expression that promised she would regret every day of the life now stretching out in front of her. What she found instead was a man standing alone by a cold, unlit fireplace, his back turned to the door, his shoulders set with the kind of stillness that came from long practice at controlling himself. He was taller than she expected. Broader too, though not in a way that suggested violence so much as simple, undeniable presence, the sort of man a room arranged itself around whether he wished it to or not. When he finally turned to face her, she found herself searching his expression for the cruelty the stories had promised her, and finding, instead, nothing she could easily name. His eyes were dark and unreadable, his jaw set tight, his whole face schooled into the careful blankness of a man who had learned long ago that showing anything at all was a danger he could not afford. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was low, quiet, nothing like the booming command she had braced herself for. "Your Grace." She dropped into the curtsy her mother had drilled into her since childhood, though her knees felt unsteady beneath her skirts. He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the urge to look away, though something in her refused to give him the satisfaction. If he was going to be cruel to her, she decided, she would at least meet it standing straight. But he did not raise his voice. He did not step closer in the way she had feared, the way that would have made her flinch. He simply watched her with an intensity that felt less like a threat and more like a man trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to be handed. "You are afraid of me," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Should I not be, Your Grace? I have heard the stories." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and gone before she could name it. "Stories are rarely the whole truth," he said, "but I will not waste breath convincing you of that tonight. You are tired, you have had a difficult journey, and a more difficult few days before it, I imagine." She had not expected kindness, she had not even known to hope for it. The unfamiliarity of it made her more wary, not less, because kindness from a man with his reputation felt like it must be a trick, a softness meant to lower her guard before the true nature of the household revealed itself. "The wedding is arranged for tomorrow morning," he continued, his tone businesslike now, as though he were discussing an appointment rather than the binding of two lives. "A small ceremony. There is no need for spectacle." "No," Eleanor agreed quietly. "I imagine there isn't much to celebrate." His eyes flickered again at that, something almost like surprise crossing his features before the careful blankness returned. "You are direct," he said. "I am tired of being spoken about as though I am not in the room," she said, and then immediately wondered if she had gone too far, if the stories were about to prove themselves true after all. But the Duke did not raise his voice. He did not step toward her with the anger she braced for. Instead, something in his shoulders eased, just slightly, as though her honesty had surprised him into something like respect. "Then I will speak plainly," he said. "This marriage was arranged out of necessity, not sentiment. I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not insult you by claiming affection I do not feel. But I want you to understand something before you walk into that ceremony tomorrow believing you are walking into danger." He crossed the room toward her then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished. She did not. She stood her ground, watching him approach with her heart hammering against her ribs, bracing herself for whatever cruelty was finally about to reveal itself beneath the calm surface. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the careful control in every line of his body, as though he were holding something back that had nothing to do with her at all. "No one will ever hurt you again," he said. "Not while you are under this roof. Not while you bear my name." The words landed somewhere in her chest she had not expected them to reach. She searched his face for the lie in them, for the trick she was certain must be hiding somewhere beneath his steady gaze, and found nothing but a strange, quiet certainty that unsettled her more than any threat could have. "Why would you say such a thing to me?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "You do not know me." "No," he agreed, "I do not. But I know what it is to be handed to someone against your will, and I will not be the kind of man who makes that worse." There was something in the way he said it, some old weight behind the words, that told her this was not simply a promise made for her comfort. It was something closer to a vow he had made to himself long before she had ever entered the room, and she was only now hearing the echo of it. Before she could ask what he meant, he stepped back, the distance returning between them as quickly as it had closed. "You will be shown to your rooms," he said, his voice returning to its earlier businesslike calm. "Margaret will see to anything you need. I will not trouble you further tonight." And then he was gone, disappearing through a side door with the same quiet efficiency he had entered with, leaving her alone in the vast, cold drawing room with nothing but his words echoing in the silence around her. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, unsure what to make of what had just happened. She had come into this house prepared for cruelty, armed with every terrible story London had whispered into her ear for years. She had not prepared herself for a man who spoke to her like a person rather than a possession, who made promises instead of threats, whose eyes held something that looked almost like restraint rather than menace. A young maid appeared in the doorway a moment later, curtsying quickly, before gesturing for Eleanor to follow her up a wide staircase lined with portraits of Ashworth ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to track her progress as she climbed. The house was as silent as it had been when she first arrived, but now the silence felt different, less like a held breath and more like something deliberately maintained, as though noise itself was not permitted within these walls. "Is he always so quiet?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. The maid, whose name she would later learn was Margaret, hesitated before answering, glancing back down the staircase as though checking they were not overheard. "His Grace does not waste words, miss," she said carefully. "But he is not what people say he is. Not in this house, at least." Eleanor wanted to ask more, wanted to press for some explanation of the strange, careful world she had just stepped into. But Margaret had already reached the door to her new chambers and was ushering her inside with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned not to linger on certain subjects. The room was beautiful, warmer, and more welcoming than she expected from a house that felt so cold everywhere else, with a fire already burning in the grate and fresh linens turned down on the bed. It was, she realized with a strange pang, more comfort than she had been shown in her own father's house in the 11 days since her fate had been decided for her. She sat by the window long after Margaret had gone, looking out over dark gardens she could barely see, turning the Duke's words over and over in her mind, until they had worn a groove she could not escape. "No one will ever hurt you again." She did not know yet whether to believe him. She did not know what darkness lived behind his careful control, what had made a man so feared by all of London capable of speaking so gently to a stranger he had been forced to marry. But as she finally climbed into the unfamiliar bed and closed her eyes against a day she never wanted to live through again, she found herself hoping, despite every warning she had ever heard, that his words had been true. Tomorrow she would become his wife. Tomorrow she would take his name and walk into a life she had never chosen. And somewhere beneath the fear that had carried her through the carriage ride and into this house, a smaller, quieter feeling had begun to take root, one she did not yet have the courage to name. She fell asleep still wondering what kind of man could be feared by everyone and gentle with no one but her. A scream tore through the east wing before dawn, sharp and sudden, and Eleanor was out of bed and halfway to the door before she remembered she did not yet know the layout of her own new home well enough to know where the sound had come from. She pulled a robe around her shoulders and stepped into the corridor, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, her heart pounding with a fear she could not quite explain. The wedding had taken place only 3 days earlier, a quiet ceremony attended by no more than a dozen witnesses, and in that short time she had learned almost nothing about the house she now called home, except that it was far too large for the silence that filled it. A door opened further down the hall, and Margaret appeared, her candle throwing shaking light across the corridor walls. "It is nothing, my lady," she said quickly, too quickly, one of the younger girls. "A nightmare, that is all." "That did not sound like a nightmare," Eleanor said. Margaret's eyes darted toward the staircase leading down toward the servants' quarters, and for a moment Eleanor thought she saw something close to fear pass over the young maid's face before it was carefully smoothed away. "His Grace does not like the household disturbed, my lady. Perhaps it is best if you return to your room." Eleanor did not return to her room. She stood in the corridor, listening to the muffled sound of low voices below, until the house fell silent once more, and Margaret finally coaxed her back with promises of answers in the morning that never quite arrived. This was how her days had begun to take shape since the wedding. She woke to a house that ran with the precision of a clock, every servant moving through their duties with quiet efficiency, every conversation stopping the moment she entered a room, as though she were still a stranger no one had decided how to speak to. Her husband she saw rarely, and when she did, their conversations lasted only minutes, brief exchanges over breakfast or brief nods passed in hallways, as though he had decided the safest distance between them was also the correct one. She had tried, in those first days, to understand him. She had watched the way the household staff flinched slightly whenever his name was mentioned, the way they lowered their voices when discussing anything to do with his business affairs, the way even Margaret, who had grown warmer toward her with each passing day, still refused to answer any question that touched too closely on the Duke's past. "He is not cruel to any of you," Eleanor said one afternoon, as Margaret helped her dress for a walk in the gardens. "I have watched him. He does not raise his voice. He does not threaten. And yet everyone in this house moves as though they are afraid of him." Margaret's hands stilled for a moment on the buttons of Eleanor's dress. "It is not fear of him exactly, my lady," she said carefully. "It is more that we have all learned what happens to those who cross him, or those he decides are a danger to this house. He protects what is his, fiercely. Some mistake that fierceness for cruelty. And what does he protect you from?" Margaret's eyes met hers in the mirror, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she might finally get an honest answer. But then the maid looked away, resuming her work with careful concentration. "That is not my story to tell, my lady. Perhaps in time, His Grace will tell you himself." Eleanor did not press further, though the question lingered with her long after Margaret had gone. She had begun to notice small things in the days since the wedding, details that did not fit the picture London had painted of her husband, the way he insisted every servant in the household be paid above the usual wage, though he never spoke of it directly and she had only learned it from an offhand comment made by the housekeeper. The way the doors to the house were locked with a level of care that seemed excessive for an ordinary residence, iron bolts and additional latches installed on every entrance as though he expected an intrusion at any moment. The way he kept 2 guards stationed near the gates at all hours, men who watched the road with the alert stillness of soldiers rather than servants. She had married a man the whole of London believed to be a monster, and yet everything she observed suggested a man consumed not with cruelty, but with the careful, exhausting work of keeping danger at bay. It was on the 5th day of her marriage that she finally understood why. She had been walking through the gardens in the late afternoon, enjoying a rare hour of solitude away from the watchful eyes of servants who seemed to appear the moment she needed anything at all, when she heard raised voices coming from an open window on the ground floor of the house. She recognized her husband's voice immediately, low and controlled even in anger, a stark contrast to the second voice, sharp and mocking, that answered him. "You cannot keep hiding behind that gate forever, Gideon," the second voice said. "Sooner or later the truth comes looking for you, and no amount of iron will keep it out. You are not welcome in this house," her husband replied, his voice carrying a warning Eleanor had not heard from him before, cold and final in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. "Leave now, or I will have you removed. Careful, brother. People might start to wonder what it is you're so desperate to protect. Or who." Eleanor froze at the word brother, her mind racing to reconcile it with everything she thought she knew about her husband's family. She had been told, briefly, before the wedding, that the Duke had no living relations beyond a distant cousin who managed estates in the north. No one had mentioned a brother. No one had mentioned this cold, mocking voice that seemed to know exactly which words would wound. She did not mean to be caught listening. She had simply stepped closer to the window without thinking, drawn by a curiosity she could not suppress, and it was in that moment that the man speaking to her husband turned his head, and caught sight of her through the glass. He smiled, slow and unpleasant, the kind of smile that made her skin crawl, though she could not say exactly why. "And here she is," he said, loud enough now that his voice carried clearly through the open window. "The new Duchess. Does she know yet, Gideon? Does she know what happened to the last one?" "Callum." Her husband's voice was low, dangerous in a way she had not heard from him before, though it was aimed entirely at the man in front of him, and not at her. "This conversation is finished." "Is it? I only thought the poor girl deserved to know what family she is married into." Callum's eyes flicked toward Eleanor again, something calculating behind the mocking smile. "Ask him sometime, my lady. What happened to Isabel? Ask him why he keeps this house locked up like a fortress. He is very good at making promises. Less good, in my experience, at keeping people safe." Eleanor did not have time to respond before her husband stepped fully into the man's path, his shoulders squared, his voice dropping to something that was not quite a threat, but was close enough that even she felt the weight of it. Whatever he said next, spoken too quietly for her to hear through the glass, was enough to send Callum backing away, his mocking smile faltering for the first time, replaced by something that looked almost like uncertainty. He left without another word, disappearing down the garden path toward the gate, though not before casting one final glance back at Eleanor, a look that felt less like a threat and more like a warning meant only for her. Her husband did not come to find her immediately after Callum had gone. She waited in the garden for nearly half an hour, her mind spinning with questions she did not know how to ask, before he finally appeared, his expression carefully composed but not quite able to hide the tension still lingering in his shoulders. "I apologize you had to witness that," he said, his voice quieter than she had heard it since her arrival. "My brother does not often visit, and when he does, it is rarely with good intentions." "You have a brother," Eleanor said. It was not quite a question, though it carried the weight of one. "A half-brother," her husband corrected. "We share a father and very little else." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "I would prefer not to discuss him further today, if you will permit me that." "He mentioned someone named Isabel," Eleanor said, watching his face carefully as she spoke the name, watching the way something dark and old passed briefly behind his eyes, before he schooled his expression back into careful blankness. "Yes," he said, after a long moment. "He did. Who was she?" Her husband looked at her for a long time before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that told her, even without the details, that whatever answer he gave her would only be the smallest piece of a much larger truth. "My first wife," he said, "and a subject I am not yet prepared to discuss with you. Not because I do not trust you, Eleanor, but because some truths are better told when there is time enough to tell them properly." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it, spoken quietly in the fading afternoon light, did something strange to her chest, softening some small part of the wariness she had carried into this house since the moment she arrived. "I am not afraid of difficult truths," she said. "I know," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, brief and unpracticed, as though he had nearly forgotten how. "That is becoming rather clear to me." He did not tell her about Isabel that evening, nor the evening after, but something had shifted between them in the garden, some small crack appearing in the careful distance he had maintained since her arrival. She found herself watching him more closely in the days that followed, noticing the way his eyes lingered on locked doors a moment longer than necessary, the way his shoulders tensed whenever a carriage approached the gate before he had confirmed who sat inside it, the way he seemed to carry the weight of some old failure that he was determined, with a fierceness bordering on desperation, never to repeat. 2 days later, an invitation arrived for a small gathering hosted by a family friend, the kind of quiet evening event that would once have felt entirely ordinary to Eleanor, but now filled her with a strange unease. She had not yet appeared in society as the new Duchess of Marchmont, and she understood, from the careful way her husband studied the invitation before setting it aside without comment, that he was weighing something more than simple etiquette. "You do not wish for me to attend," she said, watching him from across the breakfast table. "I did not say that." He set down his cup, considering his words with the same care he seemed to give everything. "I only wish to prepare you for what you will find there. London has spent years building a story about me, and very few people have ever bothered to ask whether that story is true. You will hear things tonight, if you choose to go. Whispers, questions dressed up as pleasantries. I would rather you hear them from me first." "Then tell me," Eleanor said. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder, as though weighing how much of the truth he could offer without opening a door he was not yet ready to walk through. "They will ask about Isabel," he said finally. "They will imply things I cannot yet fully explain to you. I ask only that you withhold judgment until I am able to tell you the whole of it, rather than the fragments my brother enjoys scattering wherever he goes." Eleanor studied him across the table, searching his face for any sign of the cruelty she had once believed defined him, and finding instead only a tired kind of caution, the look of a man who had been misunderstood for so long that he no longer expected anyone to see him clearly. "I will go," she said, "and I will listen to whatever they wish to say, but I will not believe it simply because it is repeated often enough to sound true." Something eased in his shoulders at that, a tension she had come to recognize as a near-constant companion to him finally loosening, if only slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, and the sincerity in his voice told her more than any lengthy explanation could have. The evening, when it came, proved exactly as difficult as he had warned. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares the moment she entered the drawing room on her husband's arm, felt the way conversations dimmed to whispers as she passed, felt the careful, probing questions disguised as polite interest from women who clearly wished to measure her reaction rather than simply make her acquaintance. "You are very brave, marrying where you did," one woman said, her smile sweet and her eyes sharp. "I do hope you sleep well at night, my dear." Eleanor held the woman's gaze without flinching. "I sleep better than I have in years," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that the words were true. She did not learn anything new that evening about Isabel, nor about the shadow that seemed to follow her husband through every room he entered. But she learned something perhaps more important, watching the way he stood beside her throughout the night, close enough that his presence alone silenced the cruelest of the whispers, patient enough to answer every barbed question with calm and measured honesty, rather than the temper London expected of him. Whatever had happened to Isabel, Eleanor understood now that it had shaped every choice her husband had made since. The locked doors, the armed guards, the vow he had spoken to her on their first night together, a vow she was only now beginning to understand had cost him something to make. "No one will ever hurt you again." She had thought, at first, that it was simply a kindness offered to ease her fear. Now she understood it was something closer to a promise made to himself. A debt he was determined to repay to a woman he had failed once before, paid now in careful attention to a wife he barely knew. She did not yet know the whole truth, but she found herself wanting to, more with each passing day, drawn not by fear anymore but by a growing need to understand the man behind the reputation, the quiet grief behind the locked gates, the strange and careful gentleness hiding beneath a name that all of London still spoke with dread. Glass shattered somewhere below stairs, and Eleanor sat upright in bed before she had even fully woken, her heart already racing before her mind caught up to the sound. It was well past midnight. The house around her was dark except for the faint glow of dying embers in her fireplace, and for a moment she wondered if she had dreamed the noise entirely. Then came the second sound, unmistakable this time, a door being forced rather than opened, followed by the low murmur of voices that did not belong to anyone in the household staff. She was out of bed and reaching for her robe when her own bedroom door opened without warning, and her husband stepped inside, already dressed, a pistol in his hand that she had not known he owned. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and urgent, all trace of his usual careful calm replaced by something sharper, more alert. "Lock this door behind me and do not open it for anyone but Margaret or myself." "What is happening?" Eleanor asked, though some instinct told her she already knew, some cold certainty settling in her stomach that this was the danger the locked gates and armed guards had always been preparing for. "Someone has come over the east wall," he said. "Do as I ask, Eleanor, please." It was the please that undid her more than anything else, the crack in his composure it revealed, and she nodded, watching him disappear back into the corridor before turning the key in her lock with shaking hands. She did not stay by the door as he had asked. She could not. She pressed herself close enough to hear, straining against the silence for any sign of what was happening below, her mind racing through every rumor she had ever heard about this house, about the danger that seemed to follow her husband like a shadow he could never quite outrun. The sounds of struggle came and went in bursts, muffled shouts, the heavy thud of something falling, a voice she recognized with a jolt of dread as belonging to Callum, sharp and furious, though she could not make out the words. She heard her husband's voice too, low and commanding, giving orders to men she assumed were the guards stationed at the gate, and beneath it all, a growing sense that whatever conflict had been simmering since that afternoon in the garden had finally boiled over into something far more dangerous. It felt like hours before the house fell silent again, though she knew it could only have been minutes. When the knock finally came at her door, 3 careful raps followed by a pause, she recognized the signal Margaret had taught her only days earlier, and she opened the door to find the young maid standing there, her face pale but her hands steady. "It is over, my lady," Margaret said. "His Grace asks that you come down. He wishes to speak with you himself, and I believe there are things he means to explain tonight that he has not explained before." Eleanor followed her down the wide staircase, past the portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to watch her descent with the same careful scrutiny they always did, until she reached the study where she found her husband standing near the window, a cut above his eyebrow the only visible sign of the struggle that had just taken place. His composure otherwise fully restored, though his eyes, when they met hers, carried something raw and unguarded that she had not seen from him before. "Callum came over the wall tonight with 2 men, he said without preamble, as though he understood she deserved the truth without softening or delay. "He has done this once before, though not since I doubled the guard after Isabel's death. Tonight he came further than he ever has, close enough to reach the servants' quarters before we stopped him." "Is anyone hurt?" Eleanor asked. One of the younger footmen took a blow to the shoulder. "Nothing serious. Callum himself will carry a broken wrist for his trouble, and a warning that the next trespass will not end so gently." He paused, some old weariness settling into the lines of his face. "I should have told you the full truth before now. I see that clearly tonight. I was a coward, hoping to protect you from it a little longer, and instead I nearly let you learn it in the worst possible way." Eleanor crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite him, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. "Isabel was not simply my first wife," he said slowly. "She was Callum's sister as well, from his mother's second marriage, which made her both my wife and, in a strange and complicated way, connected to him by blood I did not share. Our father arranged the match when we were both very young, much as mine to you was arranged, though under very different circumstances. There was no debt involved, only ambition. My father wished to bind our 2 families closer, and neither Isabel nor I were given much say in the matter." He paused, his jaw tightening, and Eleanor found herself holding perfectly still, afraid that any movement might interrupt whatever courage he had gathered to finally speak these words aloud. "She was unhappy," he continued, "deeply so, though I did not understand the depth of it until it was far too late to help her. Callum has always claimed that my coldness drove her to despair, that I failed her as a husband in every way that mattered, and for a long time, I believed him. I still carry pieces of that belief, if I am honest with you. But the truth, as much of it as I have been able to piece together in the years since, is more complicated than either of us wish to admit." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked quietly. "She died in a fall from the West Tower stairs, late one night, alone, while I was away in London on estate business I could have easily postponed." His voice remained steady, though something beneath it trembled, carefully controlled but not entirely hidden. "The coroner ruled it an accident. Callum has never accepted that ruling. He believes, or claims to believe, that I am somehow responsible, whether through neglect or something darker he has never quite dared to say aloud in front of witnesses who might hold him accountable for the accusation." "Do you believe it was an accident?" Eleanor asked. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I do not know," he admitted. "I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count, searching for some sign I missed, some warning I failed to see. I know only that I was not there when she needed me, and that failure has shaped every choice I have made since. The locked doors, the guards at the gate, the distance I kept from you even after our marriage, because I did not trust myself to protect someone I had allowed myself to care for." Eleanor sat with that admission for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle over the room like a held breath finally released. She thought of the locked gates, the armed guards, the careful, exhausting vigilance that had defined every corner of this household since her arrival. She thought of Margaret's careful silences, the servants' flinching deference, the picture of a man consumed not by cruelty, but by a grief he had never allowed himself to fully name. "You blame yourself," she said, "for something that may not have been your fault at all." "I blame myself for not being there," he said. "Whatever the cause of her fall, I was not present to prevent it, and I have spent every day since determined never to make that same mistake again. That is why the doors are locked. That is why the guards watch the road. That is why I made you the promise I did, on our first night together, though I understand now that a promise means very little without the honesty to explain why it matters so much to me." Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed the small distance between them, stopping close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the years of carefully maintained control finally beginning to crack under the weight of a truth too long carried alone. "Callum wants you to believe you are guilty of something you may not have done," she said, "and it seems to me that living inside that guilt, whether or not you deserve it, has already cost you a great deal." "It has cost me everything I once believed I might have," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Until you arrived in this house and made me wonder, for the first time in years, whether there might be something left worth protecting beyond mere duty." The words hung between them, quiet and fragile, and Eleanor found herself reaching for his hand before she had fully decided to do so, her fingers closing around his with a gentleness that seemed to startle him more than anything Callum's men had done that night. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "I was, once, but I am not any longer, and I do not believe you are the man Callum wishes London to see." Something shifted in his expression then, some old wall finally beginning to give way, and for a moment Eleanor thought he might say something more, might close the remaining distance between them entirely. Instead, he simply held her hand in his thumb tracing a slow, careful line across her knuckles, as though relearning how to offer comfort after years of believing himself unworthy of giving it. "Callum will not stop," he said finally, his voice returning to its more familiar, measured tone, though his hand remained wrapped around hers. "Tonight was not the end of this. He believes, wrongly or rightly, that proving my guilt will restore something he lost when Isabel died, some portion of the inheritance or standing he believes should have passed to him rather than to me. I fear he will not rest until he has either broken me or found some way to hurt someone I care for enough to force a reaction he can use against me. Then we face it together," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded and almost disbelieving in his expression, as though the idea of shared burden was as foreign to him as kindness had once seemed to her. "You would stand beside me in this, knowing what it might cost?" "I already stood beside you tonight," she said. "I intend to keep doing so." Before they parted for the night, Eleanor asked one more question, one that had been forming in her mind since he first mentioned the tower stairs. "May I see where it happened?" He hesitated, clearly surprised by the request, but something in her steady gaze must have convinced him she was not asking out of idle curiosity. "If you wish," he said, "though I warn you, there is little to see. I had the tower sealed not long after, and few in this house ever speak of it." He led her through a narrow corridor she had not yet explored, past a heavy door that groaned on hinges rarely used, and up a spiral of stone steps lit only by the single candle he carried. The air grew colder as they climbed, the kind of cold that seemed to live in old stone rather than simply pass through it, and Eleanor found herself understanding, without needing to be told, why he had chosen to seal this place away rather than face it each day. At the top, the stairs opened onto a narrow landing with a single window, its glass old and slightly warped, looking out over the dark gardens below. He stopped there, his hand tightening slightly on the candle, and said nothing for a long moment. "She fell from here," he said finally, gesturing toward the landing's edge, where a low railing stood, barely reaching past the waist. "The railing was old even then. I had it repaired the week after, though by then the repair meant very little." Eleanor studied the space carefully, some instinct she could not quite name urging her to look closer rather than simply accept the tragedy at face value. The railing, though old, seemed sturdy enough now, but she found herself wondering how a woman familiar with her own home, walking stairs she had climbed countless times before, might have lost her balance so completely as to fall past it. "Was there anything unusual that night?" she asked. "Anything out of place when they found her?" Her husband's brow furrowed, as though the question had not occurred to him in quite that way before, or perhaps as though he had spent so many years accepting his own guilt that he had never allowed himself to question the circumstances too closely. "A torn hem on her dress," he said slowly, memory clearly working its way back through years of careful avoidance. "I remember the maid mentioning it at the time, though I paid it little attention, grief being what it was. And a glove, found some distance from where she fell, as though it had been dropped or thrown rather than simply lost in a fall. That seems worth questioning," Eleanor said carefully. "A dropped glove could mean nothing, or it could mean she was not entirely alone when she came up these stairs." She watched the realization move slowly across his face, the years of guilt shifting uneasily beneath a new and unwelcome possibility, one he had perhaps never allowed himself to fully consider. "You believe someone else was here that night?" "I believe it is a question worth asking," Eleanor said, "rather than a guilt worth carrying alone, unquestioned, for years." He was quiet for a long time, staring out through the warped glass at the dark gardens below, And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before, something between hope and fear in equal measure. "If someone else was here that night," he said slowly, "then Callum's accusations against me have always been a way of hiding his own guilt rather than exposing mine." "It is only a question," Eleanor said gently, though she could see the thought had already taken root somewhere he could not easily dislodge it. "But it seems to me a question worth answering, before you spend another year believing a story that may never have been entirely true." They stood together at the top of the tower for a while longer, the candle between them throwing long shadows against the old stone walls, and when they finally descended, something had shifted in the careful weight he carried. Some small crack of possibility, opening in a guilt he had worn like armor for years. The fire in the grate had burned low by the time they finally parted for the night, but something had changed between them in that quiet study, some careful distance finally beginning to close. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room with her husband's words still echoing in her mind, the weight of his guilt, the fierce and desperate love hidden beneath his careful control, the danger that still waited beyond the garden walls in the shape of a man determined to destroy whatever peace they might build together. She did not yet know how the conflict with Callum would end, but she understood now, more clearly than she had on her wedding night, exactly what her husband's promise had cost him to make, and exactly how much courage it had taken him to finally share the truth behind it. "No one will ever hurt you again," he had told her once, and she had wondered then if the words were simply meant to ease her fear. Now she understood they were a vow, born from failure, a promise to himself as much as to her, and she found herself determined, with a fierceness that surprised her, to help him keep it. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay awake long after the candles had burned down, turning over every detail of the tower landing in her mind. The torn hem, the dropped glove, the railing repaired only after it was too late to matter. She thought of Callum's mocking smile in the garden, the calculated cruelty in the way he had spoken Isabel's name in front of her, as though testing how deeply the wound could still be reopened. A man confident in his own innocence rarely needed to work so hard convincing others of his guilt elsewhere. She did not yet have proof of anything. She had only a question, fragile and unformed, resting against years of guilt her husband had carried without ever pausing to examine it closely. But she understood, as she finally drifted toward sleep, that questions had a way of growing louder once spoken aloud, and that whatever answer waited at the end of this one would change everything that came after it, for both of them. For the first time since arriving in this house, she fell asleep not thinking of the danger that had brought her here, but of the quiet, careful man who had finally let her see behind the walls he had spent years building around himself, and the fierce, unexpected hope that had begun to take root in her chest in their place. A letter arrived 3 mornings later, sealed with wax pressed by no signet Eleanor recognized, and the moment her husband broke it open at the breakfast table, she watched every trace of color drain from his face. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her cup. He did not answer immediately. He read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, before finally sliding it across the table toward her without a word. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, though the message itself was simple enough to understand at a glance. "I know what you are asking the staff about the tower. Keep digging, and I will make certain everyone in London learns exactly why you sealed it in the first place. Some questions are better left buried, brother." There was no signature, but none was needed. "He has someone watching this house," Eleanor said quietly, her mind already working through the implications. "Someone close enough to know what we discussed only 3 nights ago." "Or he is guessing," her husband said, though his voice carried little conviction behind the suggestion. "Trying to frighten us into silence before we find anything that might prove him wrong." "Either way, he is frightened," Eleanor said. "A man confident in his own version of events does not send threats over a simple question." Her husband set down the letter, his expression torn between the careful control she had come to recognize and something rawer underneath it, something that looked almost like hope, struggling against years of practiced despair. "If you are right," he said slowly, "then I have spent 3 years believing myself guilty of something I did not do, while the man responsible walked free and used my grief as a weapon against me." "We do not know that yet," Eleanor said, though she reached across the table to still his hand, before he could rise from his chair in the agitation, building visibly beneath his skin. "But we will not learn it by sitting still and waiting for him to strike first." They spent the following days moving carefully, questioning members of the household staff who had served in the house since before Isabel's death, though most offered little beyond vague recollections clouded by years of practiced silence. It was Margaret in the end who provided the first true thread to follow, hesitant at first, glancing repeatedly toward the door before finally speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "There was another maid then," Margaret said. "Older than me. Her name was Hannah. She left the household not long after Lady Isabel's death, very suddenly, without much explanation given to the rest of us. I always thought it strange, my lady, how quickly she went, and how little anyone was permitted to ask about it. Do you know where she went?" Eleanor asked. Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, my lady. Only that she came from a village near Ashworth's northern estate before she was hired here. If anyone would know where to find her now, it might be someone still living there." It was a thin thread, but it was more than they had held before, and Eleanor's husband, when told, seized upon it with an urgency that told her exactly how deeply he needed an answer, whatever that answer might turn out to be. Within 2 days, a rider had been dispatched north with instructions to make careful, quiet inquiries, and Eleanor found herself watching her husband more closely than ever in the days that followed, noting the way sleep seemed to elude him, the way he paced the length of his study late into the night, as though movement alone might hurry along an answer that was, in truth, still many days away. That evening, her husband led her to a small locked room on the second floor, one Eleanor had passed many times without ever being told what it held. Inside, dust-covered furniture draped in white sheets, and a trunk sat beneath the window, untouched, by the look of it, since it had been placed there years before. "Isabel's belongings," he said quietly, kneeling beside the trunk. "I could never bring myself to sort through them properly. It seemed easier to simply close the door and leave everything as it was." Eleanor knelt beside him, and together they began working through the contents, careful and slow, neither of them speaking much as they sorted letters, gowns, small trinkets that had once belonged to a woman neither of them had truly known. Most of it told them nothing, ordinary keepsakes of an ordinary life cut short too soon. But near the bottom of the trunk, tucked inside the lining of an old writing case, Eleanor's fingers found a folded paper that had clearly been hidden rather than simply misplaced. She unfolded it carefully, and her husband leaned closer, both of them reading in silence as the words became clear. It was a letter, unfinished, written in a hand Eleanor did not recognize but that her husband identified immediately with a sharp intake of breath. "This is Isabel's writing," he said. The letter was addressed to no one, or perhaps to someone she had never found the courage to send it to, and it spoke, in halting, careful words, of a fear she had been carrying in the weeks before her death, a fear of someone close to her who had begun making demands she felt powerless to refuse. The letter did not name the person directly, ending abruptly mid-sentence as though she had been interrupted before she could finish, but the tone of it, frightened and pleading, told them both that whatever had happened on the tower stairs that night, Isabel had not simply been an unhappy wife careless with her own safety. She was afraid of someone, Eleanor said quietly, before she died, afraid enough to hide this rather than risk it being found. Her husband sat back on his heels, the unfinished letter trembling slightly in his hands, years of carefully constructed guilt visibly cracking apart as he read the words a second time. "I never knew," he said, his voice hoarse. "I was in London that week, consumed with matters that seemed important at the time, and my own wife was frightened enough in this house to hide a letter rather than trust anyone with her fear." "You could not have known," Eleanor said gently. "Whoever frightened her clearly worked hard to make certain no one did, until it was far too late to matter." He did not answer immediately, staring down at the unfinished letter as though it might yet reveal the name it had never been given the chance to write. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new and dangerous certainty, the careful doubt of the past 3 years finally hardening into something closer to conviction. "Callum," he said quietly. "It has to be him. He had access to this house. He had reason to resent her marriage to me rather than the inheritance he believed should have followed a different path. And he has spent 3 years making certain the blame for her death fell anywhere but on himself." "We still do not have proof," Eleanor reminded him, though she found it difficult to argue against the growing certainty in his voice. Difficult to imagine any other explanation that fit so neatly against everything they had learned. But this letter, together with Hannah's sudden disappearance and the money that followed it, paints a picture that grows harder to dismiss, with each new piece we find. They carried the letter to the study that night, locking it carefully in the same drawer where the threatening note from Callum still waited. 2 pieces of a puzzle slowly assembling themselves into a shape neither of them could yet fully prove, though both of them now understood, with growing certainty, exactly whose hand had likely shaped it. The waiting proved its own kind of danger. Callum did not simply send letters and retreat into silence. He appeared instead at a public gathering Eleanor and her husband were obligated to attend, a charity event hosted by a family long connected to the Ashworth name, and though he kept his distance for most of the evening, Eleanor caught him watching her from across the room more than once, his expression unreadable in a way that unsettled her more than open hostility might have. He approached her only once, catching her alone for a brief moment near the refreshment table while her husband was engaged in conversation across the room. "You are asking questions you should not be asking," Callum said quietly, his voice pleasant enough that anyone watching would have assumed idle pleasantries were being exchanged. "For your own sake, my lady, I would encourage you to stop. Why does the truth frighten you so deeply, if you have nothing to hide?" Eleanor asked, meeting his gaze without flinching. Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and dangerous, before the pleasant mask returned. "Careful," he said softly. "My brother has a talent for losing the people closest to him. I would hate to see history repeat itself so soon into your marriage." The threat was clear enough that Eleanor felt a chill move through her despite the warmth of the crowded room, but she refused to let it show on her face. "Is that a warning?" she asked. "Or a confession?" Callum's smile faltered, just slightly, before he stepped back, inclining his head in a mockery of a polite bow. "Enjoy your evening, Duchess," he said, and disappeared into the crowd before she could press him further. She told her husband everything the moment they returned home, watching the fury build behind his careful composure as she recounted the exchange word for word. "He threatened you directly," he said, pacing the length of the study with barely contained anger. "That is new. He has never been so bold before. He is frightened," Eleanor said again, though this time the words carried a different weight, heavier with the memory of Callum's eyes, the flicker of something dangerous hiding just beneath his practiced charm. Frightened enough to threaten a woman directly, in public, without caring who might overhear. That is not the behavior of an innocent man protecting his reputation. That is the behavior of a guilty one running out of options. Her husband stopped his pacing, turning to face her fully, and for a moment Eleanor saw something in his expression she had not seen before. Not simply gratitude for her support, but a fierce, protective anger that seemed to catch him by surprise as much as it did her. "I will not let him hurt you," he said, his voice low and certain. "Whatever happens between us in the end, whatever the truth about Isabel finally proves to be, I will not allow him to make you the price of uncovering it." "I am not afraid of him," Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood they were not entirely true. She was afraid, more than she wished to admit, of a man capable of such careful, calculated cruelty, hiding behind an aristocratic smile. But she was more afraid, in that moment, of what silence and inaction might cost them both if they allowed his threats to stop them from finding the truth. The rider returned from the north 5 days later than expected, with news that only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. Hannah, the maid Margaret had remembered, had indeed returned to her home village after leaving the Ashworth household, but she had left again only months later, this time for reasons no one in the village could clearly explain, taking with her a sum of money that seemed, by local account, far greater than any maid's modest savings could have accounted for. "Someone paid her to leave," Eleanor said, reading over the writer's report a second time. "Paid her well, and quickly, not long after Isabel's death." "Or she was frightened into silence," her husband said, his voice tight with a frustration that had been building for days. "Either way, it seems clear now that she saw something that night worth burying, and someone with enough money to make certain it stayed buried. Callum has access to funds through his mother's estate," Eleanor said slowly, the pieces beginning to arrange themselves into a shape neither of them wished to fully name yet, though the shape was becoming difficult to ignore. Enough, perhaps, to pay a frightened young woman to disappear before she could tell anyone what she witnessed. Her husband was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the report in his hands as though it might rearrange itself into something less painful if he simply looked at it long enough. "If this is true," he said finally, "then everything I have believed about myself for 3 years has been built on a lie my own brother constructed, and then fed to me, piece by piece, until I could no longer see past it." "We do not have proof yet," Eleanor said gently, though she understood the weight settling over him, the years of guilt beginning to crack apart under the pressure of a possibility too significant to ignore. "But we are closer to it than you have ever been before." He looked up at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, years of careful control finally giving way to something closer to hope than she had ever seen from him. "You have given me something I did not expect to find in this marriage," he said quietly. "Not simply an ally, Eleanor, but someone willing to question a truth I had long since stopped believing could be questioned at all." "We are not finished yet," Eleanor said, though she could not stop the small, fierce hope building in her own chest as she said it. Hannah is still out there somewhere. Whatever she saw that night, we will find her, and we will hear it directly, not through fragments passed along by frightened villagers. Outside, the evening had settled into full darkness, the gardens beyond the study window silent and still, though Eleanor understood now that the silence covering this house had never been about safety alone. It had been about a truth kept carefully, deliberately buried, and a man who had built his entire life around a guilt he had never truly deserved to carry. Callum's threats had not stopped them. If anything, they had only confirmed how close the truth now sat, waiting to be uncovered by two people who had finally, after weeks of careful distance, learned to trust each other enough to search for it together. Eleanor woke to an empty house. Not entirely empty, she realized as she moved through the silent corridors in the gray light of early morning, but wrong in a way she could not immediately name. The usual bustle of servants beginning their morning duties was absent. No fires had been lit. No breakfast prepared. When she finally found Margaret in the kitchen, the young maid's face was pale and drawn, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "His Grace received a message before dawn, my lady," Margaret said, "from the north. He left within the hour, taking most of the guards with him, and gave strict instructions that you were not to be disturbed until he returned." "A message about what?" Eleanor asked, though a cold feeling had already begun settling in her stomach. "About the woman he was searching for, my lady, Hannah. I believe they found her, though I do not know more than that." Eleanor's mind raced through the possibilities, relief and worry tangling together in equal measure. If Hannah had finally been found, if she had finally agreed to speak, then perhaps the answers they had been searching for since that night in the tower were finally within reach. But something about the suddenness of her husband's departure, the strict instruction that she remain behind, unsettled her more than she wished to admit. She did not have long to wonder. Barely an hour after Margaret's explanation, the sound of hurried footsteps in the hall drew her attention, and she turned to find one of the remaining guards standing in the doorway, his expression grim. "My lady, there is a carriage at the gate. Lord Callum insists on speaking with you directly. He says it concerns his Grace's safety, and that the matter cannot wait." Every instinct Eleanor possessed told her this was exactly the trap her husband had feared, the very reason he had left instructions that she remain undisturbed in his absence. And yet the mention of his safety, however manipulative it might prove to be, was not something she could simply ignore. "Tell him I will not leave this house," she said carefully. "If he wishes to speak with me, he may do so from beyond the gate, where the guards can hear every word exchanged." The guard nodded and disappeared, and Eleanor followed a few minutes later, standing at a careful distance from the iron gate, while Callum waited on the other side, his expression carrying none of the mocking confidence she had come to expect from him. For the first time since she had met him, he looked almost afraid. "Your husband has ridden into a trap," Callum said without preamble. "I know because I said it, though not the way you likely believe. I paid Hannah to leave this house 3 years ago. Yes, that much is true, and I have spent every day since regretting it. But I did not pay her to protect myself from suspicion of murder, my lady. I paid her to keep silent about something far more painful, and far less criminal, though I understand now how badly that silence has cost all of us." "Explain yourself," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended, though fear for her husband was beginning to override her caution. "Isabel came to me before she died," Callum said, his voice tight with an old grief he had clearly never allowed himself to speak aloud before. "Frightened, desperate, convinced someone in this household meant to harm her, though she would not say who. I did not believe her fully, God forgive me. I thought her simply unhappy in a marriage she had never wanted, prone to exaggeration born of loneliness. I told her to speak with Gideon directly rather than come to me with fears I did not know how to address." "And Hannah?" Eleanor pressed. "Hannah witnessed an argument the night Isabel died," Callum said, "between Isabel and someone else in this house, though not my brother. I paid her to leave because I believed, at the time, that the truth would only bring more pain without changing anything, without bringing Isabel back. I built my accusations against Gideon out of my own guilt, my lady, not out of any real belief in his violence. I needed someone to blame besides myself for failing to protect her when she came to me for help." Eleanor felt something cold settle over her, a dawning understanding that the danger they had been circling for weeks was not simply Callum's cruelty, but something else entirely, something neither of them had yet considered. "Who did Isabel argue with that night?" Callum's eyes darted toward the house behind her, and his voice dropped lower, urgent now. "The housekeeper who served this family for 20 years before your marriage, my lady. Mrs. Bell. She resigned suddenly not long after Isabel's death, citing age and failing health, but I have since learned she remained close to a distant cousin who stood to inherit a portion of the estate should Gideon die without an heir. I believe now that Isabel discovered something Mrs. Bell wished kept hidden, and that the argument Hannah witnessed was not simply a disagreement, but a warning that turned deadly. And you believe Gideon has ridden into danger with this same woman? The message that summoned him north this morning came from someone claiming to be Hannah, offering to finally speak the full truth, Callum said. I have reason to believe it was not Hannah at all, but Mrs. Bell herself, luring him away from this house under false promise of answers, perhaps to silence him before the truth could fully surface, perhaps for reasons I cannot yet guess. I came here the moment I understood the danger, my lady, though I know you have little reason to trust anything I say after the way I have behaved these past weeks. Eleanor's mind raced, weighing the sincerity in Callum's voice against every reason she had to doubt him, every threat he had made, every cruel word spoken in gardens and crowded rooms designed to frighten rather than help. And yet something in his desperate urgency now felt different from the calculated menace she had grown used to, something raw and genuinely afraid that she did not believe he could easily fake. Where has he gone? She asked. An old hunting lodge 2 hours north, on land that once belonged to Isabel's family, before it passed to Mrs. Bell's cousin through a series of transactions I only recently uncovered, Callum said. I have men riding there now, though I fear I may already be too late to prevent whatever Mrs. Bell intends. Eleanor did not hesitate long. Whatever doubts she carried about Callum's true intentions, the danger to her husband felt too immediate to weigh carefully against old grievances. I am coming with you, she said. My lady, it is not safe. Neither is standing here arguing about it while my husband rides further into danger, Eleanor said, already turning toward the stables where a horse could be readied within minutes. You may accompany me, or you may explain to him afterward why you chose to stand at this gate debating propriety while his life hung in the balance. The ride north felt longer than the 2 hours Callum had promised, the countryside blurring past in a haze of cold wind and mounting dread, Eleanor's thoughts consumed entirely by images of her husband riding unknowingly into a trap set by a woman he had trusted for 2 decades. Callum rode beside her in tense silence, offering no further explanation, though she caught him glancing at her more than once with an expression she could not quite read, something between wariness and grudging respect. They reached the hunting lodge as the afternoon light was beginning to fade, and Eleanor's heart seized at the sight of her husband's horse tied outside, riderless, no sign of him anywhere near the entrance. Callum's men, arriving only minutes ahead of them, had already begun searching the surrounding grounds, their urgent shouts carrying across the cold air as they spread out toward the tree line. It was Eleanor herself who heard the voices first, faint and carried on the wind from somewhere behind the lodge, and she was moving toward the sound before Callum could stop her, her heart pounding with a fear sharper than anything she had felt since first arriving at her husband's gate weeks earlier. She found them in a small clearing behind the lodge, her husband standing with his back against a fallen tree, blood visible on his sleeve, facing an older woman Eleanor recognized instantly from a portrait that hung in the Ashworth family gallery, though the woman's face now carried none of the warmth captured in that painted likeness. Eleanor's breath caught at the sight of the pistol, her whole body going still with a fear sharper than anything she had known before, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow entirely to the small clearing, the fading light, the desperate tension held between 3 people whose lives had been quietly unraveling toward this moment for 3 long years. Mrs. Bell, Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. The older woman's eyes flicked toward her, calculation replacing the cold fury that had been directed at her husband only moments before. The new Duchess, she said, her voice carrying a bitterness that seemed to have been building for years. Come to watch history repeat itself, have you? It does not have to, Eleanor said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the fear coursing through her at the sight of the pistol Mrs. Bell held, aimed steadily at her husband's chest. Whatever happened between you and Isabel, whatever reason you had, it does not need to end this way again. She was going to ruin everything, Mrs. Bell said, her voice cracking slightly, years of carefully guarded secret finally spilling loose. My cousin was promised this estate should the Ashworth line fail to produce an heir. I have served this family faithfully for 20 years, watching every penny of that inheritance dwindle, while Gideon's father spent recklessly and left nothing but debt behind him. My cousin's claim was the only thing standing between years of service and being cast aside with nothing to show for it. Isabel discovered the arrangement, threatened to expose it to Gideon, and I could not allow that discovery to cost my family everything we had been promised. So you killed her, Eleanor said quietly. the pieces finally settling into a shape too painful and too clear to deny any longer. "I frightened her," Mrs. Bell said, her voice trembling now. "I only meant to frighten her into silence. She pulled away from me at the top of those stairs, lost her footing, and I—" She stopped, her composure cracking entirely, the pistol wavering slightly in her grip. "I told myself for 3 years it was an accident. I let Gideon carry the guilt because it was easier than confessing what I had done." Eleanor's husband, still bleeding from the wound at his shoulder, spoke then for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, his voice low and steady despite the pain clearly etched across his face. "Put down the pistol, Mrs. Bell. Whatever happens now, more violence will not undo what has already been done." For a long, terrible moment, the older woman did not move, the pistol still trembling in her hand, years of guilt and desperation warring visibly across her face. Then, slowly, her shoulders sagged, and the weapon lowered, falling from fingers that no longer seemed to have the strength to hold it. For a moment longer no one moved. The wind stirred the bare branches overhead, scattering the last of the fading light across the clearing, and Eleanor watched her husband's face carefully, searching for any sign that he intended some desperate action that might end in tragedy rather than resolution. But he remained still, his eyes fixed steadily on Mrs. Bell, patient in a way that surprised her, as though he understood better than anyone that the older woman's confession had already cost her whatever fight remained in her. "You served this family faithfully," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the fury Eleanor might have expected after 20 years of misplaced trust. "I never once doubted your loyalty, Mrs. Bell, not until this very moment. I do not understand yet how loyalty curdled into something capable of this. But I do not believe you rose this morning intending to end my life, any more than you rose that night 3 years ago intending to end Isabel's." Something in his measured words seemed to reach her where nothing else had. Mrs. Bell's shoulders shook, a sound close to a sob escaping her before she could stop it, and the pistol dipped further in her trembling grip. "I have not slept a full night since," she whispered. "Not once, in 3 years. I told myself it was an accident so many times I nearly believed it, but I have watched you carry my guilt on your own shoulders every single day since, and it has been a torment worse than any punishment a court could offer me." It was in that moment of wavering resolve that Callum's men finally reached the clearing, moving carefully at his signal rather than rushing in, and the older woman, seeing herself surrounded, made no move to resist as the pistol was finally taken from her hand. Callum's men reached the clearing moments later, and what followed passed in a blur Eleanor would only fully process much later that night. Mrs. Bell taken into custody, her husband's wound tended by a physician summoned urgently from the nearest village, the long, exhausted ride home beneath a sky finally clearing of the storm clouds that had gathered throughout the afternoon. It was only once they were finally alone, back within the walls of their own home, her husband's shoulder bandaged and his color slowly returning, that Eleanor allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. "You could have died today," she said, her voice breaking slightly for the first time since she had heard the sound of Callum's urgent knock at the gate that morning. "I very nearly did," he admitted, reaching for her hand across the small distance between them. "And I would have died still believing myself guilty of a death I had no part in causing, had you not chosen to ride north despite every reason you had to distrust the man who brought you the warning." "Callum was telling the truth," Eleanor said softly, "about all of it." "It seems he was," her husband agreed, something complicated moving across his expression. 3 years of resentment beginning the slow, difficult work of reconciling itself with a truth far different from the one he had believed for so long. "I owe him an apology I do not yet know how to give, and he owes me the same. Perhaps, in time, we will find the words for it." Eleanor tightened her grip on his hand, feeling the steady pulse of his heartbeat beneath her fingers, grateful beyond words for the simple fact that he was alive to hold it all. "Tonight," she said, "let us simply be grateful this is finally over." "Not entirely over," he said quietly, though something in his voice had softened. The old careful distance she had first encountered on her wedding night finally, fully dissolved. "There is still a truth I owe you, Eleanor, one I have been too afraid to speak until now." She looked up at him, waiting, and found in his eyes something she had not expected to find so soon after the danger of the day, something warm and unguarded and entirely new. "I did not simply marry you out of necessity," he said. "I have come, in these past weeks, to care for you more deeply than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone again. I did not expect it. I certainly did not deserve it, carrying the guilt I carried. But it is true, and I find I no longer wish to hide it from you." Eleanor felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest at his words, the fear of the day finally giving way to something gentler, something she had not dared to hope for when she first arrived at this house as a frightened stranger forced into a marriage she had never chosen. "I have come to care for you as well," she said quietly, "more than I ever expected to, when I stood at that gate weeks ago, certain I was walking into danger." He raised her hand to his lips then, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, and Eleanor understood, watching the last of his careful guardedness finally fall away, that whatever came next, they would face it together, no longer as strangers bound by necessity, but as two people who had finally, against every expectation either of them had carried into this marriage, found something worth protecting in each other. The knock on Eleanor's door came earlier than expected, and when she opened it to find Margaret standing there with an expression torn between excitement and nerves, she knew before a word was spoken that today would not be an ordinary day. "The magistrate has arrived, my lady," Margaret said. "His Grace asks that you join him in the study. Mrs. Bell's confession has been formally recorded, and there are matters he wishes you to hear directly." 3 weeks had passed since the clearing behind the hunting lodge, 3 weeks in which the household had slowly begun shedding the careful, watchful tension that had defined it since Eleanor's first night beneath its roof. The locked gates remained, old habits not easily abandoned, but the guards had grown less numerous, their vigilance softened from desperate necessity into simple, sensible caution. She found her husband in the study with a man she did not recognize, papers spread across the desk between them, and the moment she entered, he rose and crossed the room to take her hand, a gesture that had become as natural to him now as breathing, though it would have seemed impossible to imagine on the cold night of their wedding. "Mrs. Bell has confessed fully," he said, once the magistrate had departed and they were finally alone, "not only to Isabel's death, but to the arrangement with her cousin, the falsified inheritance documents she used to justify her actions to herself. The truth is finally recorded, Eleanor, beyond any doubt or rumor. My name is cleared, though I confess it matters less to me now than I once believed it would." "Why less?" Eleanor asked, though she thought she already understood the answer. "Because I have already found something more valuable than my reputation," he said, drawing her closer. "I found it in a woman who chose to ride north into danger for a husband she had every reason to distrust, rather than wait safely behind locked doors for news that might never come." Eleanor smiled, though the memory of that desperate ride still carried a weight of fear she suspected would take longer to fully fade. "I could not have done otherwise," she said simply. "Not once I understood what was at stake." A letter arrived from the north a week later, one that finally answered the question of what had truly happened to the maid, whose sudden disappearance had first set them on this path. Hannah had been found, alive and well, living quietly under a different name in a coastal town, having used the money Callum paid her years earlier to build a modest, independent life far from the household where she had witnessed something she had never wished to see. When approached gently and assured of her safety, she agreed to give a full account to the magistrate, confirming every detail of Mrs. Bell's confession and closing the final gap in a truth that had taken 3 years to fully surface. She wept, apparently, when told the truth had finally come out, Eleanor's husband said, reading the report by the fire one evening. "She has carried her own guilt all this time, believing her silence had allowed an innocent man to suffer for a crime he did not commit." "Perhaps you might write to her," Eleanor suggested. "Not to accuse, but simply to release her from a guilt she never deserved to carry either." He did write, that same week, a brief and gracious letter thanking Hannah for her honesty and assuring her that no blame rested upon her shoulders for choices made out of fear rather than malice. It was, Eleanor thought, watching him seal the letter with careful attention, exactly the kind of quiet grace she had come to recognize as the truest measure of the man beneath the reputation London had once been so eager to believe. Her own family required a different reconciliation entirely. Her father arrived at the house unannounced one afternoon, hat in hand, his usual bluster noticeably absent as he was shown into the drawing room where Eleanor sat with her husband reviewing correspondence. "I read the accounts in the papers," her father said, his voice carrying an awkward uncertainty Eleanor had rarely heard from him. "I did not know, when I arranged this marriage, what manner of danger I might be sending you into. I confess I did not think much beyond the debt at all, and I am ashamed to admit it now." Eleanor studied her father for a long moment, old resentment warring with the simple fact that despite every fear that had accompanied her arrival at this house, she had found something here she would not now trade for any other life. "You could not have known how it would unfold," she said finally, "and I find, despite everything, that I do not regret where it has led me." Her husband rose then, extending a hand to her father with the same measured courtesy he offered everyone, whatever history stood between them. "You are welcome in this house," he said simply. Whatever arrangement first brought us together, your daughter has become the truest partner I have ever known, and I am grateful, however imperfect the path, that it led her to my door." Her father's visit did not erase years of careful distance built between them, nor did Eleanor expect it to. But it was, like the fragile peace slowly building between her husband and Callum, a beginning worth having, and she found herself grateful for even that small measure of healing among all the rest. There remained one difficult conversation neither of them had yet found the courage to have, and it arrived 2 days later in the form of Callum himself, arriving at the gate without the mocking confidence that had once defined every visit, his expression instead carrying the uncertain caution of a man unsure whether he would be welcomed or turned away. Eleanor watched from the drawing-room window as her husband met his half-brother in the garden, the same garden where their first bitter confrontation had taken place weeks earlier, and though she could not hear the words exchanged between them, she watched the careful, halting way they spoke, two men attempting to bridge 3 years of resentment built on a foundation neither of them had fully understood until now. It was not a swift reconciliation. Callum's guilt over the years of accusation he had leveled against his brother, however understandable given his own grief and his misplaced trust in Mrs. Bell's careful manipulations, was not so easily forgiven, nor should it have been. But something had shifted between them nonetheless, some old wound finally beginning the slow work of healing rather than festering further, and when Callum finally departed that evening, Eleanor's husband returned to the drawing room with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something like relief, mixed with a grief he had perhaps never fully allowed himself to feel until this moment. "He asked after you," he said, settling beside her near the fire. "He wished me to convey his gratitude for riding north despite everything he had done to earn your distrust. He was frightened for you," Eleanor said. "Whatever else he has done, that fear was genuine." "I believe it was," her husband agreed. "We have a long way yet to travel before I would call us close again, if we ever fully manage it. But it is a beginning, and I find I am grateful for even that much, after years of believing no reconciliation would ever be possible between us." The weeks that followed brought a slow, steady transformation to the household Eleanor had first entered as a frightened stranger. The heavy silence that had once filled every corridor gradually gave way to something warmer, servants no longer flinching at the mention of their master's name, laughter occasionally drifting up from the kitchens in the evenings, a lightness settling over rooms that had spent 3 years holding their breath. A grand ball hosted by one of London's oldest families arrived near the end of that season, the first major event the household had attended since the truth of Mrs. Bell's confession had spread fully through society, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 curious eyes the moment she and her husband stepped into the crowded ballroom together. To her surprise, Callum was already present, standing near the edge of the room in a manner that suggested he had arrived early and deliberately, rather than by chance. He crossed toward them the moment they entered, and Eleanor watched the room's attention sharpen further, half of London clearly expecting some fresh scandal to unfold between the brothers whose feud had provided years of whispered entertainment. Instead, Callum inclined his head toward his brother with a formality that carried genuine respect rather than mockery. "I have spent the better part of this evening correcting anyone foolish enough to repeat old rumors in my hearing," he said, loud enough for those nearby to catch every word. "My brother carried a burden that was never rightfully his for 3 years, in part because of accusations I made in my own grief and confusion. I do not intend to let that injustice continue one moment longer than it already has." A murmur moved through the nearby guests, surprise evident on more than one face, and Eleanor watched her husband's expression shift, something between gratitude and lingering disbelief crossing his features as his brother continued speaking, publicly and without hesitation, dismantling with careful, deliberate words the very reputation he had once worked just as deliberately to build. "He is trying, in his own way," Eleanor murmured to her husband later that evening, watching Callum across the crowded room engaged in animated conversation with a group of gentlemen who had clearly been repeating the old rumors only minutes before. "He is," her husband agreed, something warm settling into his voice. "I did not expect it, not so soon, and certainly not so publicly, but I find I am grateful for it, more than I know how to properly express." The evening passed in a slow unraveling of old suspicion, conversation after conversation shifting from careful curiosity to something closer to genuine welcome, and by the time they finally departed for home, Eleanor understood that whatever fear had once defined her husband's place in society had begun, truly and finally, to fade into memory. London's whispers changed as well, slowly at first and then with the swift, fickle enthusiasm the ton always brought to any scandal freshly resolved. The stories that had once painted her husband as a man to be feared transformed, almost overnight, into a different kind of tale entirely. One of a wronged duke who had carried undeserved guilt with quiet dignity for 3 long years, finally vindicated by a wife brave enough to question a truth everyone else had long since accepted. Eleanor found the sudden shift in public opinion almost as unsettling as the fear that had preceded it. The same women who had once offered her sharp, probing questions at social gatherings, now competing for invitations to her own drawing room, eager to claim closeness with a couple whose story had become, in the space of a single season, the most talked-about romance London had seen in years. "They forgive so easily, once the story turns in your favor," she observed one evening, watching her husband review a stack of invitations that had arrived that week alone, more than the household had received in the entire preceding year. "London forgives whoever proves most entertaining," he said dryly, though there was little bitterness left in his voice now. The old caution finally softened by weeks of steady peace. "I have learned not to place much value in their opinion, whichever direction it happens to be blowing. I care only for the opinion of the woman sitting across from me." The household itself continued its quiet transformation in the weeks that followed the ball, each small change marking the distance they had traveled since Eleanor's frightened arrival. Margaret, who had once measured every word so carefully around questions of the Duke's past, now laughed openly in the corridors, teasing the younger staff with an ease that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The housekeeper who had replaced Mrs. Bell ran the household with warmth rather than fear, and even the guards at the gate had traded their grim vigilance for the relaxed alertness of men no longer bracing for disaster at every turn. Eleanor found herself, in quiet moments, reflecting on how completely her expectations of this marriage had been overturned. She had arrived believing herself bound to a stranger, feared by all of London, prepared to endure a lifetime of careful distance and quiet suffering behind locked gates. Instead, she had found a partner whose fierce protectiveness had never once been cruelty, whose silence had been grief rather than coldness, whose careful control had finally given way, under the weight of shared danger and shared trust, to something as warm and steady as the fire that now burned nightly in every hearth throughout the house. It was on a quiet evening some weeks later, the two of them walking together through gardens that had finally begun to feel like home rather than a fortress under siege, that Eleanor found herself thinking back to the frightened young woman who had arrived at this house weeks earlier, certain she was walking into a marriage with a monster. "Do you remember what you said to me, that first night?" she asked, stopping beside the same cold fireplace where they had first stood together as strangers. "I remember every word," he said quietly. "No one will ever hurt you again. I meant it as a promise then, though I understand now it was also a hope I did not yet dare believe I could fulfill, carrying the guilt I carried." "You kept it," Eleanor said, "even when keeping it nearly cost you your life." He reached for her hand, drawing her closer, the fire finally lit and crackling warmly in the grate beside them, so different from the cold, unlit hearth of that first frightened meeting. "I intend to keep it every day that follows this one as well," he said, "not out of guilt any longer, Eleanor, but because I have come to love you more deeply than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone again." The words settled over her like warmth long denied, and Eleanor felt the last of her own careful guardedness finally dissolve entirely. 3 years of caution and fear falling away in the face of a love she had never expected to find in a marriage born from necessity rather than choice. "I love you as well," she said softly, and watched something in his face transform entirely, years of careful control giving way at last to open, unguarded joy. He kissed her then, gently, in the same room where he had once made her a promise she had not known whether to believe, and Eleanor understood, standing in the warm firelight with his arms around her, that the frightened girl who had arrived at this gate weeks earlier had found something far greater than safety within these walls. She had found a partner, a protector who no longer carried his vigilance out of guilt, but out of love freely given and freely returned. A home built not on fear, as London had once whispered, but on a promise finally, fully kept. Outside, the gardens had grown quiet in the deepening evening, the same gardens that had once witnessed threats and confrontations, now holding nothing more dangerous than the soft rustle of leaves in a gentle wind. The locked gates still stood, old habits worn into the fabric of the house itself, but Eleanor no longer felt them as walls keeping danger at bay. She felt them, instead, as the careful boundaries of a home finally at peace, built by two people who had learned, against every expectation either of them carried into this marriage, that trust could grow even from the coldest of beginnings, and that love, once earned honestly, was worth every difficult step it had taken to find it. The Duke of Marchmont, once the most feared man in England, stood in his own garden that evening, with his wife held close against him, and for the first time in 3 long years he felt nothing but peace. Snow fell steadily over the estate the morning Eleanor felt the first stirrings of a suspicion she had not yet dared to voice aloud, and she stood at her bedroom window watching it settle over gardens that had, over the past year, become as familiar to her as the home she had left behind on the night of her wedding. A full year had passed since the confrontation in the clearing, since Mrs. Bell's confession had finally cleared her husband's name, since Callum had stood before half of London and dismantled the very rumors he had once so carefully cultivated. The household ran now with a warmth Eleanor could scarcely remember it lacking, though she knew, whenever old memories surfaced, exactly how far they had traveled to reach this quiet, settled peace. She found her husband in his study, as she usually did at this hour, reviewing correspondence from the northern estate with the same careful attention he brought to every responsibility, though the tension that had once lived permanently in his shoulders had long since eased into something closer to contentment. "You look troubled," he said, glancing up the moment she entered, his instincts for her moods as sharp now as they had once been for danger alone. "Not troubled," Eleanor said, crossing the room to sit across from him, "only uncertain how best to share something I have suspected for some weeks now." His expression shifted immediately, concern flickering behind his careful composure, and Eleanor found herself smiling despite the nervous flutter in her own chest, understanding exactly how far his protective instincts still extended, even now, even in peace. "I believe," she said carefully, "that we are to have a child." The stillness that followed lasted only a moment, before something extraordinary transformed his face entirely, the careful control he had worn like armor for so many years, dissolving completely into open, unguarded joy. He rose from his chair and crossed to her side, kneeling beside where she sat, taking both her hands in his with a gentleness that reminded her, achingly, of that very first night, when he had made her a promise neither of them had yet understood the full weight of. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "As certain as I can be, without a physician's confirmation," Eleanor said, "though Margaret suspects the same, and she has seen enough of these signs among the household staff over the years to trust her instincts." He pressed his forehead gently against her hands, and when he finally looked up, Eleanor saw tears standing openly in his eyes, an expression she never could have imagined from the cold, guarded man who had greeted her in this very house a year earlier. "I did not allow myself to hope for this," he admitted quietly. "Not after Isabel, not after everything that followed. I told myself I did not deserve such happiness, that the past had claimed too much of me to leave room for a future so bright." "The past does not decide what you deserve," Eleanor said gently, "only what you choose to build from here forward." The news, once confirmed by the physician a fortnight later, moved through the household with a warmth that seemed to touch every corner of the estate. Margaret wept openly with joy, the younger staff exchanged excited whispers whenever Eleanor passed, and even the guards at the gate, who had once watched the road with grim, unyielding vigilance, now spoke of the coming child with a tenderness that told Eleanor, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how completely fear had given way to hope within these walls. Callum arrived within days of hearing the news, his usual careful formality replaced by something warmer, something closer to the brother Eleanor imagined he might have been, had circumstances allowed such a relationship to flourish naturally from the start. He brought with him a small, carefully wrapped gift, a set of tiny embroidered garments that had, he explained with unusual hesitation, once belonged to Isabel's own childhood, saved carefully by their late mother and passed to him years earlier. "I do not know if it is right to offer them," he admitted, standing somewhat awkwardly in the drawing room while Eleanor unwrapped the gift with careful hands. "Given everything that has passed between our families, but it felt wrong to let them sit forgotten any longer, when there might finally be a child in this house who could use them." Eleanor's husband studied the small garments for a long moment, old grief and new joy moving visibly across his face in equal measure, before he finally looked up at his brother with something that had been years in the making, a genuine and unguarded gratitude. "Thank you," he said simply, and the two words carried a weight far beyond their brevity. 3 years of estrangement finally, fully bridged by the small, careful gesture of a man determined to make amends however he could. Word of the coming child spread beyond the household as well, and Eleanor found herself, in the weeks that followed, receiving letters of congratulation from corners of society that had once viewed her marriage with nothing but suspicion. The same women who had once whispered warnings about sleeping soundly under her husband's roof now wrote with genuine warmth, eager to claim some small connection to a story that had, in the span of a single remarkable year, transformed from cautionary tale into the kind of romance London loved best to tell. Eleanor read these letters with a quiet, private amusement, understanding now how little weight society's shifting opinion truly carried against the steady, hard-won peace she had built within her own walls. She answered each one graciously, though she found herself far more interested in the quiet evenings spent by her own fire than in any invitation extended by women who had once been so quick to doubt her husband's character. The months that followed passed in a gentle rhythm Eleanor had never imagined possible when she first arrived at this house, prepared for cruelty and finding instead a slow, steady unfolding of trust and tenderness she had never dared to hope for. She spent quiet mornings walking the gardens with her husband, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back, spent long evenings by the fire listening to him read aloud from books he had once kept locked away in a study no one but he had been permitted to enter, spent quiet, contented hours, simply existing in a home that no longer held its breath against the danger that had once defined every corner of it. Her father visited more frequently as the months passed, his earlier awkward shame slowly transforming into something like genuine pride, and Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, grateful for even this imperfect reconciliation, understanding that the debt which had once bound her to this marriage had, over the course of a single remarkable year, transformed into something neither of them could have predicted when the arrangement was first struck. The child arrived on a bright morning in early spring, the household holding its breath through a long night of careful waiting, before the sound of a newborn's cry finally broke the tension that had gathered in every corner of the house. Eleanor's husband, who had paced the length of the corridor outside her chambers for the better part of the night, was permitted inside only moments after the physician finally emerged, and Eleanor watched, exhausted but deeply content, as he crossed the room to her side with an expression of wonder she suspected she would remember for the rest of her life. A daughter, the physician announced, and Eleanor's husband knelt beside the bed, his hand trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the small, sleeping bundle held carefully in her arms. "She is perfect," he whispered, and Eleanor watched years of careful guardedness finally, completely dissolve, replaced by a tenderness so profound, it seemed to reshape the very lines of his face. They named her Isabel, after careful consideration and quiet agreement between them both, a choice that honored a woman whose death had shaped so much of their beginning, transformed now into something gentler, a name carried forward not in grief but in remembrance, a small act of grace that closed a painful chapter with something resembling peace rather than sorrow. Callum, when he arrived to meet his young niece some days later, stood for a long moment simply looking down at the sleeping infant, something unreadable moving across his face before he finally spoke. "She would have liked that," he said quietly, and Eleanor understood, watching the careful emotion in his expression, that whatever guilt still lingered between the brothers, over the years lost to misunderstanding and grief, this small, hopeful gesture had done more to heal it than any formal apology ever could have. As the seasons turned and little Isabel grew from infant to curious, laughing toddler, the estate that had once stood locked and guarded against every shadow of danger transformed fully into a home defined by warmth rather than fear. The gates remained, old habits worn permanently into the fabric of the household, but they no longer felt like walls holding danger at bay. They felt instead like the quiet boundaries of a family finally at peace, built from a foundation that had once seemed impossibly cold and had grown, through patience and honesty and hard-won trust, into something neither Eleanor nor her husband could have imagined on the night they first stood together as strangers in a silent, unlit drawing room. On quiet evenings, when their daughter had finally been settled to sleep and the house had grown peaceful around them, Eleanor and her husband often returned to that same drawing room, the fire always burning brightly now where once it had stood cold and unlit, and she would sometimes catch him watching her with an expression of quiet wonder, as though he still could not quite believe the life they had built together from such an unlikely beginning. "Do you ever think of that first night?" she asked him once, settled comfortably against his side as the fire crackled warmly before them. "Every day," he admitted. "I think of how frightened you looked, standing in that doorway, certain you had married a monster. And I think of how far we have both traveled since, from two strangers bound by necessity, to this, whatever this has become between us. Love," Eleanor said simply. "It has become love, and a family, and a home built on something far stronger than the fear either of us carried into it." He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, drawing her closer against him, and Eleanor closed her eyes, listening to the steady, contented beat of his heart beneath her cheek, understanding at last that the promise he had made her on that first frightened night, however small and uncertain it had seemed at the time, had grown into something far greater than either of them could have imagined. No one would ever hurt her again, he had told her, and in the years that followed, through danger and revelation, and the slow, patient work of building trust from the ground up, he had kept that promise every single day, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of a love that had grown, quietly and steadily, into the truest foundation of the life they now shared.